The water year, it runs from October 1st to September 30th every year. And that's how we in the water world measure the year, because it roughly comports with sort of the beginning of the fall and winter season, where you start having some precipitation and the water supply is building up in the snowpack and in reservoirs over the winter. And then through the spring, that begins the runoff period. And through the spring and summer, you have runoff, you have irrigation, and then that is pretty much done at this point. And so then we begin a new water year and we start tracking the snow and the precipitation based on that.
Hello and welcome again to another Sacktown Talks. Today we're glad to be joined once again by Alexandra Beering, now with the California Farm Bureau. Alex, thanks for joining us again. How's it going?
It's going well. I'm now at the Farm Bureau. I've been there about 6 or 7 months now. So I'm their senior advocate, senior policy advocate for water issues primarily. And that means that I get to deal with a lot of the things I dealt with before when I was at Friant Water Authority, but my portfolio is even bigger now. So things in the Klamath Basin, things in the Delta, things in Imperial. So it's a bigger portfolio, but it was also a pretty intense year in terms of water, not just the availability and supply and hydrology, but also the level of interests at a policy level when it comes to, things like water rights or groundwater or anything like that.
Different.
So there was just a slew of bills this year. So it's been a hectic year, but a fun one.
Yeah, so it's interesting. So since there was so much water, people's attention turned from what do? We don't have enough water to we have so much water. How do we split it up? Is that kind of what you're saying?
I don't know necessarily, but I think, prior to this year, we had about 3 to 4 years of pretty deep drought. And so everyone's wheels started turning about what do we do if this continues? How do we make sure that we are able to conserve or to allocate water supplies in an equitable and fair way? How are we going to make sure that we have the right level of ag production and still supply enough water to cities and municipalities? And so that set the stage for this year from a policy standpoint. But then we had this enormous water year. In fact, I was going to wish you a happy new year because it is a new water year. On Sunday was the first day of water year 2024.
So October 1st is
October
always
1st.
the new water year. Huh?
Yes. So it's a different cycle than...
And we got some rain, I think, didn't we?
I know we did get a little this weekend. Actually, on the year ended September 30th with a little bit of precip,
what does that
which
mean?
was crazy.
Did the groundhog see its shadow?
I think it did. Yeah, it must have. No, the water year, it runs from October 1st to September 30th every year. And that's how we in the water world measure the year, because it roughly comports with sort of the beginning of the fall and winter season, where you start having some precipitation and the water supply is building up in the snowpack and in reservoirs over the winter. And then through the spring, that begins the runoff period. And through the spring and summer, you have runoff, you have irrigation, and then that is pretty much done at this point. And so then we begin a new water year and we start tracking the snow and the precipitation based on that. So we couldn't really, if we did it based on the calendar year, you would kind of cut off halfway through the winter season. Right. So it doesn't make sense. So the new water year is always October 1st.
So last time we talked, we just gotten tons of rain, tons of snow.
Yeah.
And we were kind of worried about the snow melting a little too fast, coming down, kind of happened pretty gradually, I guess. How much snow is still up there? I don't even know. Is any left?
At this point, I'm not sure what it is right now. The last snow survey they do typically is on April 1st, because that is kind of like the peak of the snow accumulation during the year.
I was like, I know people were skiing on 4th of July.
I skied on 4th of July. Yeah. It was miserable. It actually felt like I snowboarded. So I was riding and it felt like I was riding through mud snow. Like at the very top of the mountain, there was snow, and then it turned into slush. And then it felt like I was snowboarding on pasture, which was a really strange experience. And I did 2 runs just to say I did it at Palisades. But yes, it was you still conceivably could do it. And in fact, the week prior to that, the conditions were actually quite good because there had been such cool temperatures. We actually had not a wildly hot summer or spring. But on April 1st of this year, the snowpack was statewide at 232% of the historical average. So it was like at least double and some more what it would have been and what we would have expected to see. So that was pretty phenomenal. But so at this time of year, we're not looking at snowpack anymore. We're looking at what is the reservoir storage? How do we end up the year? Different reservoirs have different abilities to refill and empty over the season. So for some of them, it's not a great indicator. But right now, as of Saturday, I guess, it was 128% of average for the water levels in the reservoirs. So that meant that we were able to supply water for irrigation, water for cities, water for people to use, water for fish, all of these different uses that we all have in California when we talk about water. And we still had some left over. So there is some amount of carryover storage going into this season. And so people have asked, well,
like what a budget surplus?
It is. Wow. It is a little bit. Well,
like
but
a rainy day fund now.
It is like a rainy day fund. But it's so for some of those reservoirs, they've got more space as we go into the winter season. What folks always look at now is like, what's going to happen this year if we get another big storm year? If we have 31 atmospheric rivers like we did last year, which was not record breaking. The wettest year on record was still 82, 83, I believe. We had like 40
Do you remember that?
inches. I mean, I was like 2, so no. But I do vaguely remember, I think in 86, we also had a pretty big year. And I remember driving over the H Street Bridge and what the water level looked like in the American River at that point. But I think, we're going into this year. Last year, we were going into a winter season where we had a lot of reservoirs that were pretty low, like they were well below average. Yeah. And this year we're going into the winter, into the flood season with higher than average storage. So it's going to be important for flood managers in particular to be very, very cautious and very careful as they figure out how to balance releasing enough water to make room for flood storage, but not so much that if we don't get a big year, then we're in trouble later in the year. And that was, this year when we talked last January, the concern that I had raised was, well, we just had 3 weeks of incredible snowfall and rain, and it was at least half of the average precipitation we would expect the entire year. And so my concern, and that was a concern a lot of us had, was what if there's no more? What if nothing else comes? And it did. It kept coming and coming and coming and coming. So the benefit that we had of having that cooler spring was really that everyone was really concerned about what would happen in the Tulare Lake Basin and everything, because Tulare Lake came back, which was
I even knew there was a Tulare Lake. Did you know about that before?
Yes,
yeah,
I did.
You did?
I did. Yes. But it hadn't reappeared since 97 and 83 before that.
Oh, really? Wow. Okay.
And it was, it inundated this year, I think 100,000 acres of farmland. And
I think I saw something online and it said like basically the whole valley was a lake.
Yeah.
Is that true?
Yes. Yeah. Well, the Tulare Lake Basin, that was historically one of the largest freshwater lakes in the Western United States. And it was seasonal and it wasn't every year. But when it did happen, it was kind of looked like what happened this year. And it's hard to know. It was a challenge, I think, for a lot of agencies, state agencies, local agencies, and landowners at first to figure out what to do when all this water was coming, because there wasn't really a readily available release valve to get it out of there. And there's still a lot there. It's going to take some of those areas probably 2-3 years to dry out before they can plant again. So
and then like I remember last time we talked, there was like a lot of like subsiding in the land,
right? And that's part of the problem.
Pumping water out.
Yeah, that's part of the problem.
Being fixed by all this new water?
I wish. I think there's some areas where you can do some amount of recharge, but the Tulare Lake Basin generally, the soil isn't really suitable for doing passive recharge. So a lot of folks are like, well, yeah, maybe that'll just recharge the groundwater basins under Tulare Lake by all that water there. And it just doesn't really happen that way, unfortunately. So I think, it will continue to be a challenge, but we were concerned that, and I think everyone was concerned that it would be much worse early on in terms of the flooding, because Corcoran almost flooded and you've got Lincoln State Prison there. And there are towns and cities around.
We used to have famous inmates there. Charles Manson.
I think he was there.
Did he get out?
Yeah.
He was there. I don't know.
He was there.
Did we release him? I don't know.
Did we release him?
Is he alive? No, I think he's dead.
I can't remember
Yeah.
actually. I think anyway. Yeah, I think he did die. Don't quote me. I don't know. That's not my true crime area of interest.
Right.
So this year we have a new water year, and my new water year's resolution is to buy flood insurance, especially this year.
You think it's coming, huh?
I try. Well, so back to the point about having a big water year. When you have multiple drought years and you don't have a lot of carryover storage and you don't have that pressure in potentially during the flood season for adding more water into the reservoirs, then, I mean, I still buy flood insurance. I live in Sacramento. I'm going to do it. But years like this are the ones that I think many of us are watching and thinking, again, water managers will have to be careful about how they manage the floods and the flood water that's coming into those reservoirs, because at a certain point you have to release that pressure. That puts pressure on the levee system. And so it's going to be something that, you just want to be careful about and prepare for.
That's interesting. So like last year we got so much water, but because we didn't have any water, we had tons of room to handle it. Now you're saying this year we could expect a lot more water again, and we don't necessarily have the room. So we're gonna have to release a lot.
I think that's basically right. It's not to say that there wasn't flooding. Obviously there was flooding. I mean, there was not just flooding one of the reasons that Tulare Lake Basin flooded in part is that there were a lot of creeks and rivers that flowed into there historically and haven't in many years, but they don't have dams on them. They don't have, large floodplains to meander on. So there was just a lot of uncontrolled water coming down, and that was happening in other streams and creeks in other parts of the state. Part of, I think Wilton flooded off the Cosumnes River last winter. So there was flooding this past year. But I think going into a year like this, the concern is if you do have another wet year, you may end up with so much water that you have to really release a lot of it into the rivers. And that's when, again, that puts some amount of pressure on the levee system. I think, people say the forecasters have predicted that there's a 95% chance that it'll be an El Nino year, and everyone wants to know what that means. It
used to mean like a lot of water.
Kind of. Yeah, I guess you're right. I think there are so many other forces at play when it comes to what shapes a year's hydrology. And so, yes, maybe it will be a wet year, but maybe it won't. We're not sure.
It used to be like there was a thing called like the Farmer's Almanac that would tell you, like predict the future, would tell you exactly what happened. Have the farmers given you the almanac? Do you know the playbook for this year?
I don't know the playbook for this year. I don't know the playbook, but I would say farmers tend to be conservative a lot of the time. And I don't mean that politically. I just mean that in terms of how they want to prepare and leave the smallest they don't want to take a big risk. And they'd rather go for the sure things. So I think at the very minimum, what a lot of folks are going to be hoping for is early allocations. If they are contractors, say for the State Water Project or the Federal Central Valley Project, they want to know and will probably be, I would imagine that those projects will have an earlier allocation this year. And the allocation just means when the people that operate those projects, the state of California and the federal government, when they tell the users of those projects how much water they predict them to have in any given year. And so, last year, I think everyone almost had a full allocation last year, 100% of their contract water supplies. And that's important for the valley, in the San Joaquin Valley, the Sacramento Valley, and in Southern California, because those are some of the largest water contracts in the state, and they serve 27 to 30 million people. So it should be a good year. I think you can say that with some amount of predictability. I think as well, for those that could do a lot of recharge this year, they were able to do that. And one of the reasons they were able to do that was because of the governor's executive order that sort of cleared the path for folks to be able to do recharge without having to go through this typically long process to secure water rights to flood water to then do the recharge projects. So there was, I would say, I don't want to use the word streamlining because I think that word is overused, but definitely easing the path for a lot of people to just take some flood water out of the river and pump it down to the ground, or not pump it necessarily, but do a recharge project and make use of that flood water.
So your previous position, you worked for the Friant Water Authority, was a lot about kind of moving water up and down the canal.
Oh my gosh, yes.
Now you have kind of more a statewide focus.
Yeah.
And you got to look more, I guess, at agriculture, right?
Sure.
What people are growing. So kind of what's different, and kind of what are you kind of working on now that you weren't working on before?
Well, so what I've come to learn, and I guess I knew this before, but when I was at Friant, they were all Friant contractors were federal water contractors. So they had water contracts that were basically based on rights that the federal government had to supplies going back for the first half of the 20th century. What I've come to realize, though, is throughout a lot of the rest of the state, the water rights situation is a little different, and they're not necessarily relying on federal water rights or state water rights. They're relying on their own water rights. And that is definitely the case in a lot of rural areas way up in Northern California and other places where they're very historic, very old water rights going all the way back to the gold rush. And they've really been under scrutiny this year in particular because, you asked earlier about, well, is all this water that we had this year, did that tee up the policy discussions that we had this year? And to a certain extent they did, but not entirely, because previously we had been in that drought. And so people started looking at water rights and they started saying, are these equitable? Is this the right way to do it? Is there a simpler way to make sure we can manage our water supplies during extreme droughts like we've just experienced, so that everyone gets what they need and we don't put additional stress on the ecosystems and things like that? And so flowing out of that multi-year drought were many policy proposals out there in the legislature and elsewhere that focused on reforming some aspect of California's water rate system as administered by the California State Water Resources Control Board. So that has actually taken up a large chunk of my time this year, because there are so many Farm Bureau members who are historic water rights holders. And a lot of them are in tiny little stream systems or way up in Northern California or down in Imperial or the Delta or wherever. And so it's something that I think broadly, the water community the water user community was very focused on this year. There were a few bills that were in the legislature. I think there's only one now that made it to the governor's desk, which is SB 389, which was a bill by Senator Allen. And I think all these bills have been very well-intentioned in terms of what they're trying to do to help the state have the tools that they need in order to enforce water rights and make sure that water rights are equitable in an extremely scarce year. But some of them went a little further than that, which was kind of drew the ire of many of us in the water user and diverter community, and certainly within the ag community. Yeah,
I think we hear the term water rights, but I don't think many people know what they are, how people got them. Like you mentioned, like they go back to the gold rush.
Oh yeah, some of them
a water right is like a property right you can own, even though it's not necessarily on your property.
Well, yeah, it's really complex. So I'll do my best to give a short answer, and I know I'll screw something up and hear something from some water rights attorney out there, I'm sure. But a lot of the water rights in California, so in the gold rush, around that period when California started becoming more populous, I think there were a couple things going on. And I mentioned the gold rush in part because some of the earliest water rights that were developed and are on the record were related to hydraulic mining in the Sacramento region and the Sierra Nevadas. And so a lot of folks would divert water off a stream for the purposes of using in a hydraulic, it's like a cannon that blast the side of the mountain to dislodge gold and what have you. And so there were a lot of early attempts to take water from one section, from one part of a river, and move it somewhere else for another purpose. And so those records of those sorts of rights, there are a couple different types of water rights. So let me back up. In 1914 is when the State Water Resources Control Board began to regulate water rights and began to sort of control and oversee how water rights are developed and assigned. Prior to that, anyone who has a prior to 1914 water right, that is considered a senior water right. And they can be either, riparian, which means you're just using the water right next to the river or the stream that it's next to, or they can be appropriative, which is you, again, are taking it from the stream over here and using it over here for another reason. So those are two general buckets of types of water rights. And California is a little confusing because we have those two types of water rights. And a lot of other states, they just have like if you're by the river, you can take the water out of the river. That's a riparian right. But we have all these provisions to allow people to literally move water from one section of the state to the other for a purpose, for a beneficial use is what they call it, for farming, for cities, for fish now and things like that.
And you can buy these, right? You can buy and sell
You
them?
can't, well, sort of, yeah. I mean, it gets pretty complex. Now, in some other states like Nevada, there actually is a market for water rights that you have like water rights brokers that are like real estate brokers. And it's all, and I think it has to do with how arid the state is, that, you know, all of this is well documented. You can buy and sell and trade these water rights. We don't quite have the same system in California, but there are opportunities. People transfer water rights, they sell water rights, and it can get pretty complex. And I think that was part of the motivation that folks had this year for trying to simplify the system and make it a little bit more straightforward in how the water board administers rights, because it is complex and you do need attorneys to work through this with you. And some of these water rights are like written on a parchment in someone's steamer trunk in their basement. I mean, it does get complex, and that makes it a little confusing. Well, really confusing, as well as it's something that makes people nervous. Like there's some shadowy thing going on with water rights. And I don't think there really is, but you know, when times get scarce in terms of water supply and you're deep in a drought, that's what people start looking to, is what's going on over here? Is this really legitimate? Do you really have a water right? And that's sort of the nascence for some of these proposals, I think.
That's fascinating. It's just generationally just been passed down, some of these.
Yeah. I mean, especially if you're talking about some of the folks in the Delta or way up in Northern California. I mean, some of these are, you know, people's families moved here in the 1860s, 1850s and started taking water out of the river and using it for something. And yeah. And so it's not to say that people shouldn't have to be able to prove that they do have a water right if it comes to that, if there's a reason for it. But I think the general idea that it's really easy to just show your documentation for your water right is hard for a lot of folks, particularly because the water system was being developed initially at a time where there were not good records. Yeah. This is the 19th century. I mean, yeah.
So since, you know, you're working for the Farm Bureau now, are you digging in more into like actual crops? Are you like learning more about like rice and pistachios and almonds? And
well, I had the benefit.
What they need water wise, and
I had the benefit of working previously for the Friant division of the Central Valley Project, and that is the east side of the San Joaquin Valley, and that is among the most diverse ag production region in the state. There's some regions that focus and have specialties in certain areas, but the specialty crops grown in that region really ran the gamut. Anything from, you know, tree fruit and citrus to nuts to row crops and carrots and tomatoes and everything. So it was a really diverse region, and I think the rest of California is equally diverse. But I have had to learn more about things like grazing. Not something grazing, like rangelands.
Oh, okay. You cover that as well.
I mean, to the extent it's related.
There's not a ranching bureau.
No. Well, we do have we have specialists. So at Farm Bureau, we have specialists in all of these areas. So my bucket is only water. I only do water, but water's connected to a lot of other things. Yeah. So when you're talking about grazing, you're talking about how do you manage water quality when there are cattle around. And so, but we do have someone that handles the cattle piece, and she's really good. Her name is Katie Little, and she's fantastic. But
cows have droppings.
Then it bleeds. Yeah, everything sort of bleeds into each other a little bit. So we have a lot of issue areas that overlap. But yeah, I mean, just from a operational standpoint, California ag is really diverse, and so the kind of operations that I was working with in the San Joaquin Valley on the east side, where folks had mostly a lot of good access to groundwater as well as surface water supplies, and a lot of folks are growing permanent crops. It's different up in, say, the Klamath Basin. Mm-hmm. It is very different down in Imperial.
Yeah, can you tell us about it? Like, what are they growing in Imperial? Like, everyone thinks it's desert, and then you go down there and you're like, oh wow, there's actually like greenery around here.
Oh yeah. Well, I'm still learning, so I don't really want to overstate things, but I know that one thing has gotten a lot of attention, and I don't think it's necessarily fair, and that's alfalfa. Because of the Colorado River crisis right now. I mean, I don't know if you've been following, but the Colorado River is think of where California was last year from a statewide hydrological perspective, say 2022, and then imagine that if it didn't actually stop, it didn't end this year, and it just, kept going. And
so we got all this water, but it didn't
necessarily manifest throughout the West. Wow. Yeah. In the Colorado Basin, they didn't have the year we did. And so there were already some pressures on the Colorado River supplies. It supplies 7 states, 2 countries, multiple tribes. And that is a much more complex negotiation to try and figure out a long-term management plan for that. But from a use standpoint, farmers in Imperial have among the most senior water rights to the Colorado River. And there are a lot of things grown in Imperial, but one of them is alfalfa. And that's actually caused a lot of, I think, we were talking about almonds before, how people just or pistachios, whatever it is. Every region's got their crop that everyone likes to point out and say, that's the bad one. But I think realistically, there are very good reasons that someone would grow alfalfa, especially in a place like Imperial. I think a lot of people don't realize the sort of trade-offs, you have to make as a farmer in terms of what can grow here with the water supply I have, with the type of soil I have, with the climate I have. And I had a reporter reached out to me, and she was from Boston or something, a public radio station out there. And she said, I'm curious, are California farmers growing the right things? And I said, yes, they are. They're because the right thing.
Economics, right?
Right thing is what you can grow with the soil you have, the water supply you have, the climate you have, and what the market demands. Mm-hmm. And if you can do those things, you will pick the right choice in terms of what to produce with all of those factors. So it's both simple and more complex. And I mean, we've made a decision as a society not to dictate what farmers have to grow. That's up to them. Right. Unless you're in an area like, say, the Yolo bypass or other areas where it's a designated floodway or something. And so then there are some restrictions that can come into place when it comes to like crop insurance and things like that. Yeah. But for the most part, we leave it up to them. And so if you're growing alfalfa at Imperial, you're probably growing it for a good reason. You're either growing it for cattle or you're growing it. I know, there's also been some attention about them shipping alfalfa out or shipping almonds out, and we're exporting our water. Well, I mean, I would rather export those things than import them from someplace else, to be honest. So,
yeah. So like rice is always something that's always talked about.
Oh, yeah.
And it needs a lot of water. Mm-hmm. And I think the last 2 years, they basically couldn't grow rice, or they couldn't. There were some restrictions on them, right? And the federal government gets involved too and says, you guys can't grow rice this year, but we'll pay you anyways, or something.
Well, like it's not about what you can grow and what you can't. It's whether or not you have your water supply. Right. You have your full. And that was that last year was actually in 2022. That was an anomaly. It was I think the first time that the Sac Valley guys had taken such a huge hit in terms of their water supply. I think it was only about 70% of what they had typically gotten. So there were huge reductions in the rice crop, which, I mean, I know that some people have noticed that there was an effect on the ancillary benefits that you have from growing rice, whether it means, habitat for waterfowl or whatever, that there were some negative effects from that reduction in production. And that reduction in production came from a lack of water supply. And and so then it's like the boom and bust though. And then we swung back to this year and things are good.
So last when we talked, we talked about, there was a lot of talk about a water bond.
Yeah.
Where did the water bond end up this year?
Well, I think there are still proposals out there. And I mean, I've heard anything from 15 billion to 25 billion, which are numbers that just boggle the mind.
Wow. Because last time you said all we need is like 7 billion.
It's counterintuitive, but when the economy is really bad is when you end up borrowing money for the things that benefit everyone.
Right.
And so because you can't assign that particular cost to one entity. And so things like habitat restoration, some amount of flood control improvements, other infrastructure, conveyance, things like that. Hopefully those will all be part of whatever the bond package is that comes out. But I believe last I heard is that they're targeting November 2024. So we've got a little bit of time to wait. Yeah.
So they got to pass it next year, before June, right?
Yeah.
It's kind of interesting. They passed a couple other measures, but they didn't move that.
Yeah. I mean, people start thinking about things like natural resources and climate bonds when we are in a crisis, when we are in the middle of an extreme event where it doesn't feel, I mean, this year was a flood year. It was an extreme year, but not in a bad way. It wasn't like the fifth year of an extreme drought. And so when you're in the middle of an extreme drought, that's when people are poised, I think, psychologically to consider spending that amount of money. But this year, it turns out we had so much water. And it made clear that there was a need for further investments in some places. And there were some policy changes that needed to come into being. And I think the governor put together a pretty good infrastructure package that was passed this summer in terms of CEQA, limits on CEQA and resolution of CEQA lawsuits, and streamlining for infrastructure construction and things like that. So, but then we also, there was an incredible amount of flooding in the Pajaro region and the Pajaro Valley and Pajaro River. And it made very clear where we needed to invest for future flood events.
Right. So in your new role,
yeah,
you were actually a registered lobbyist.
I am.
Is that right?
I know.
Can you talk to us kind of
I can't pretend. I couldn't pretend anymore. I just had to do it.
What is the difference between what you were doing before and kind of what you're doing now, other than, you can't buy some people?
That was going to be my first answer, was like, I can't actually buy someone a glass of wine anymore. Which is,
well, you can, as long as it's under $10.
That's
right?
true. Well, but who wants a glass of wine under $10? Just kidding.
That should be a separate show.
That should be a separate show. So yeah, I mean, I think that is obviously one of the bigger things. Also, just like you keep track of your time differently. Instead of keeping track of how I'm spending my public agency's dollars on certain projects or how to budget for the next year or something, I'm keeping track of how many hours I'm spending on which bills or which matters before state regulatory agencies, which is a different way of accounting for your time, most certainly. I think also, it's been a learning curve for me because I've spent 18 years working in water. So I feel pretty confident on some of the policy aspects, and I feel confident in relationships I have, but I don't always know the process super well. And there are a lot of unspoken rules that go on in the lobbying world and in the building that, nobody writes them down. They just kind of exist. And so I've definitely sent some texts off to friends like, hey, so what did that actually mean? When they did that, what does that mean? Or what were the implications? There's a lot of reading between the lines that there's no instruction manual for. So that's the learning curve, is like those sorts of rhythms and those sorts of communications.
Yeah.
I know, but it's also process.
Right.
It's the process of it.
So what are the politics in the farm world?
Oh gosh. Everything. I mean,
like, well, I don't know, like the ones that were really public lately were like, you had union workers versus farmers. That was really public one.
That was,
what
and
else
I don't, that is definitely not in my bucket.
Right.
It's in someone else's bucket. I think ag is always kind of having a bit of an existential crisis in California, because it is such a good state for growing things. This is such a good place to grow things, and we've engineered a system to allow that to happen on a massive scale. I mean, like acre for acre, nobody produces what California produces. I mean, it doesn't even come close. You have 3 crops grown in Iowa, right? And they have like millions and millions of acres for those 3 crops. And we have far fewer acres for 400 specialty crops that can grow with much less water and much more abundance than they can anywhere else. And so it really is a system and a state that is naturally suited and well engineered to support agriculture. But, it's also the most populous state in the union. And it tends to be, I think voters and residents in California tend to want to protect the environment. And so there's always this tension of how do we hit the right point for regulation and making sure that farmers can do their job at the same time as we protect the other public values that have become important to Californians. And that is, I think, the driving factor and that's what drives a lot of the politics, I think, of farms and farmers and ag in California. But I think, I've I'm a very nonpartisan voter. I'm a very nonpartisan person. That's why I actually got out of politics initially, because I thought I'm really bad at being like associated with the party, because I can't hang
toe
with
the line,
I can't toe the line. I'm bad at that. And so it took me a while to come back around and realize that water politics was different. It didn't always line up as partisan politics in the same way. And that is why I like it. But I think generally, people think of farmers as conservative, and I like politically conservative, and there are certain areas and regions where they are. But I think it's much more diverse than that. And I've actually been really impressed by the diversity of our members, the Farm Bureau members, who, I mean, I'm not going to throw shade at anyone, but there were plenty of times in my career previously where I was like the only woman in the room on something in the ag world, right? And that's just not the case anymore in this current role, because there's just a large diversity in California. And I really do see that on display. So I think, another thing that I'm hope I don't get myself fired for saying this, but is that I'm just kidding. I think we have to be realistic about where we live and know that there are politics at play in California where, being really hard lined about something isn't going to work. And you have to know who you're working with. And I think that's why the new speaker, everyone is really excited about.
He's an ag guy, right?
He's an ag guy from like Salinas. And he was actually our administrator, Jim Houston. He was, speaker was his intern once upon a time, way back in the day. So he has a good relationship with farmers and ag and Farm Bureau. And I think we're all hopeful that he will be really balanced and thoughtful and be protective of farm workers and their communities and their employers. And so we're feeling optimistic about that. That's really good. And I think, I don't want to generalize because farmers are pretty diverse.
That's a good point. Farm workers need farms to work on.
Oh, yeah. I mean, and I think there's also a misconception. Went on a tour earlier this summer with some folks in the Valley and a couple members and staff. And we were talking to an irrigation district down there who started doing these strategic recharge projects. They realized that some of their employees I won't name all the communities because I don't want to out people on this, but we're having either wells go dry, even in a year like this, a really wet year. It takes a while for groundwater aquifers to bounce back, even in a wet year. Mm-hmm. And so they were realizing that a lot of their employees obviously had like groundwater contamination, water quality issues in their groundwater wells, or water supply issues. And so they started locating groundwater recharge projects, like putting recharge basins right next to the towns, where they would just pull in all this fresh water that was this like pure, pristine snowmelt and deposit it right there next to the town. Because, well, if you're in the water business, you know that there's this little rhyme that people talk about. The solution to pollution is dilution. In other words, flush out, right? Yeah. The less water you have in those aquifers, the more the water quality problems become apparent and worsen. The more water you can get there, you're not just helping the supply problem, you're helping the contamination problem. Right. So they started just doing this of their own accord. And there have been some like state grants and funding available for that. And some of the staff and members were like, oh, did you apply for the state grant funding for this? And the irrigation district manager said, no, because it takes too long. And we just had to do it now because people in our community were having a problem. So I say that as an example of things like that happen all the time. Farmers don't like talking about things they do. It's just like not in their nature to say, hey, we're doing this cool thing because it feels boastful, or it's like, oh, why would you do that? We're just doing this because these are our neighbors and employees. So I think that there's a misconception that there's like you're pitting, employers against employees, farm workers against the farmers. And it's just not really there. I think it's a false construction sometimes.
Yeah.
So
kind of how many bills were you following this year, and kind of how'd they end up? What's on the governor's desk that you either like or don't like?
Yeah. Well, so the one that I was actually looking at the list yesterday of all the things I tracked. I think it was about 50 to 60 water related bills, which is far more. I don't even know how much more. It was a lot more. I would usually track maybe a third of that.
So like, were you here till the end of session till like
kind
midnight?
Of, but I mean, it felt a little anticlimactic because there were some very high profile water bills that we had really pushed on earlier in the year. And so they were just turned into 2-year bills mostly, but there was the one that got through on the water rights piece. So there were 3, sometimes I say 3, sometimes 4 water rights bills that we were focusing on. One was AB 460. That one had to do with increasing penalties for violating a state water board order, as well as giving the water board new enforcement tools to issue like a cease and desist order if they thought there were illegal diversions happening. There was AB 1337, which would have brought the most senior water rights holders under full purview of the state water board, even in wet years, and gave the water board tools to manage watersheds kind of at will, and had that penalties piece. So those were 2 bills. The first one was from Assembly Member Rebecca Bauer-Cahan, and the other one was from Assembly Member Buffy Wicks. Those 2 we had pretty big concerns with, as did pretty much everybody in the water community. I actually said to a friend who worked for one of the nonprofits that was a sponsor for one of these bills, you've done something phenomenal that nobody else has done in decades, which is unite the entire water community from the border of Oregon all the way to Mexico and from the east to the west in opposition to something. Right. Because a lot of people did view that, again, as some sort of existential threat. And so those bills were turned into 2-year bills. 2 of them were really, the nascence for them came from some incidents in August of 2022 where there were folks up in the North State who were like really loud and vocal about the fact that they intended to violate state water board orders and divert water when they were told not to. And it kind of put the spotlight on everyone else. And so then we were in this defensive position of like, hey, don't treat us all like we're bad actors. Like most of us are just trying to follow the rules of the law and follow what the water board directs us to do. And I think so those 2 bills were focused on that. They're kind of in the parking lot right now because they were turned into 2-year bills. Right. The one that made it the governor's desk was SB 389, again from Senator Ben Allen, and that one just like basically lays out and it explains the water board's authority to ask for information about someone's water right, even if it is a senior water right, one from the gold rush era, right? It lays out like the water board can ask you for information about your water right. They can issue an order to make you tell them information. But they have to go through a couple of hurdles and over a couple of hurdles to get to that point. They have to explain why they need it. They have to provide evidence for why they need it and share that with you. And there's then another, regulatory sort of process and public information process they have to follow. And there were also originally some provisions in the bill that related to forfeiture of water rights, and that people got really upset about that. Yeah. But his office was really good, I think, and most of us ended up just going neutral on that bill because we viewed it as just an explanation of what's in the law already and a confirmation of the fact that the water board does have powers to ask for information about anyone's water right claim. Mm-hmm. You just have to prove why you want to do it. And that way people aren't going to be asked for information capriciously, especially, again, if it's on a piece of parchment in someone's steamer trunk in the basement, right?
So who are the major players in these water rights conversations?
I mean, Farm Bureau, Association of California Water Agencies, California Municipal Utilities Association, California Chamber of Commerce. I mean, and then every single water agency, basically. I mean, every member had a water agency in their district that was concerned about these bills. Every single member.
And then does like every crop have like its own little, like, I know like they have like rice.
They're commodities groups. Yeah. So there's like the
pistachios as their first.
Yeah, there's the pistachio. So it's funny. My dad was a consultant and packaging designer for a lot of the ag industry, especially in the San Joaquin Valley and in the Salinas Valley and part of the Sacramento Valley. And he always referred to his guys. It was like his walnut guys or his salad guys or whatever. And so now when I find myself talking about different commodities, I refer to them as the guys, which someone told me recently I shouldn't say guys. It should be y'all. So it's the pistachio y'alls instead of pistachio guys. But so yeah, you've got like Citrus Mutual, you have California Fresh Fruit, you've got like Almond Board and everything. So everything has its kind of own advocacy group, and they were all involved as well. And then we've got, California Farm Bureau's got, I think, still learning all the numbers, 53 farm bureaus.
Wow.
That's because we have 56 counties, but a few counties combine their farm bureau. Oh, do we have 50? Oh, yeah. So there are a few counties that combine their farm bureaus with like multiple counties, and then there are 2 counties without farm bureaus.
Which are those 2?
Can you guess?
There's no farming going on.
Can you guess? Just
San Diego?
Oh my gosh, no way. San Diego's big. San Diego's really big in nurseries, avocados.
Inyo?
No, but that's close. Inyo is, it's similar.
Modoc.
No, Modoc is big too. No? Okay, I'll save you. But you're in the right vein. No. So Alpine. Okay. And it really just has to do with like the number of people. And then the other one is very different from that.
It's got to be like right where Death Valley is somewhere.
No. Think of what's completely different from a very rural, sparsely populated area.
So San Francisco, maybe. Yeah.
Bingo. Now, they can always establish a farm bureau if they want to.
And is there any farming in San Francisco?
There is. Yeah. There is
urban farms?
Yeah, so there are. Actually,
is marijuana part of this too?
No, not even. Yet. No, actually, I think I did hear recently that we have our first farm bureau member who is a commercial grower of marijuana, but it is not in San Francisco.
No.
Yeah. So there are small farms in San Francisco, a lot of urban farms, community gardens. And, it really comes down to how much farming is going on and how many people are doing it. And there's a formula that helps you determine whether or not you can establish a farm bureau, but it certainly doesn't stop. If people think they can make a case for it in San Francisco or Alpine, they can go for it, but it just hasn't happened. So, so we've got all those different counties and, a lot of them were involved in this as well because they viewed this as a threat too. Mm-hmm. So
why should, I guess, like, what do we almost have 40 million people here? Mm-hmm. Why should they care about water rights? Why is it important to them?
I think there's been a larger conversation that people have wanted to have recently about, inequities and like historic wrongs in California, especially when it comes to how the state was settled. And, taking land away from people and making, I think generally being aware about California's history and some of the more problematic elements of it, which there really have been. And there was a time where there were very few people that could have a water right? Like, I don't think it's unfair to acknowledge that, like, I wouldn't have had a water right back in the day. There are a couple other people around us and hanging out with us today that probably wouldn't have had one either. And that's because there were limitations and it was, and this is not just for water though. This is for any property right. Mm-hmm. And it goes back to water rights being associated somewhat with property rights and being a kind of property right in a lot of cases. And people want to talk about if it was such an inequitable system that birthed the water rights system, maybe we should redo it all. But I think the challenge there is that, it's a complex system, and it's not perfect. But I mean, the number of lawsuits, I said this to someone recently, you would employ like 3 generations of the complete industry of water rights attorneys for 3 generations if you tried to redo the entire water rights system in California. And I don't know that it would be any better. And it would, by the time the major impacts of climate change come further in this century, you would still be fighting about how to reallocate water on a stream system. And it would be a process we'd started in 2023. So I don't think that from a practical, pragmatic, realistic standpoint, it makes sense to redo water rights, particularly when they are property. But then again, I understand why people want to have that conversation and I get where it's coming from. And I think that's one of the reasons that this is a conversation right now, is that we're not just talking about how to make sure we have water for the environment. We're talking about how to make sure that the decisions we make about water are equitable.
Are there any conversations about like the state, I guess, like taking water rights, like buying them back?
The state holds a lot of water rights already. There already holds a ton of water rights. In fact, the state of California is one of the largest water rights holders in the state. So, it's there are two halves of the brain on that for the state of California. You are a regulator, but you're also a water rights holder. So I guess the state could somehow try to seize everyone's water right, but I mean, chaos is at a minimum what it would bring, and probably not with a lot of benefit that is visible other than to the people who are going to be litigating that.
Yeah. Can you establish new water rights?
Yes.
Like, I can just go buy some property by a river and just.
Well, yeah. So if you bought a piece of property that had a riparian water right attached to it, yeah, you would come with a water rights.
Yeah.
And you can do that. You can absolutely do that. The other way that you can do it is you can apply for a water right at the State Water Resources Control Board. They can, especially for some areas, you can apply. A lot of groundwater sustainability agencies are applying for like floodwater diversion rights. So the ability to divert water when extra water is available during a flood year for recharge, right? So you can do that, and a lot of agencies are doing that. And if you sign up on the Water Board's website, you'll get a notice every time a new application is filed, and there are a whole bunch of them that have been filed. In fact, they've been trying to make it easier for people to apply for those types of water rights because they know that with Sustainable Groundwater Management Act and other things, we have to get more water into the ground. So you can do that. They're also, but I think, a lot of the state's rivers are fully appropriated. They're actually listed as like fully appropriated streams, meaning there's no new water there. It may come at a different time because of hydrology, because climate change will make that runoff period I was talking about earlier in like it starts around April. It will make it earlier, like March or February. It will move it back because we'll have, potentially a warmer climate and different types of precipitation, but there's no new water out there.
Yeah. So you just ended this session, kind of. So what are you guys looking forward to next session?
Oh my gosh.
Other than keeping those bills that became 2-year bills asleep.
Yeah. Well, I don't know that. Look, if people violate water board orders, it doesn't help anyone. Mm-hmm. It puts a spotlight on everyone. So there's still an appetite among many in the water community to have a conversation about how to improve enforcement of water rights. How to make sure that people are not diverting illegally, because that's not good for anyone. It hurts it. Since there's no new water, if you're diverting illegally, you're diverting water that was supposed to be for something else, whether it's for fish or for people or for farms. So that conversation will continue.
What's the pie look like for water between fish, people, and farms?
So, let me think about that for a minute. I think I might have a note on that. Okay. Urban water use in the state is around 10 million acre feet per year. And I think we talked about last time, acre foot is the amount of water that you would need roughly to cover a football field with 1 foot of water. So there are 10 million acre feet of water on average used by urban customers and urban folks every year in California. And ag water use is somewhere between 30 to 35 million or so acre feet per year. So it's roughly like 3 times as much. But it takes more water to grow something than it does to stay alive as a human. You know what I mean? Like it's like apples and oranges. You can't really compare water use for people with water use for crops because they just use water. And
is that crops and animals? It's all like
ag water generally. So whether you're using it for cattle or using it for crops.
And then how much goes to nature?
Oh, I should have. So I'm going to put a plug in here. California Bountiful is a foundation that the Farm Bureau has, and we have a gentleman there named Ami who is amazing, and he runs the foundation. He's been doing a ton of work lately on water use, and I neglected to bring his slide deck, which actually would have been very helpful because it answers this question. But I think when you look at the whole pie, I think the single biggest use is typically for the environment. We have laws in place that are such that the environmental allocation has to be maintained. And that, when we talk about water years, when we talked about it being a new water year, every water year has a type. And so this last year was obviously a wet water year. But like hydrologists and water managers and state and federal agencies look at what the forecast for the year is going to be like, and then that affects how they operate the infrastructure, whether it's the pumps in the delta or how much water they release from the reservoirs. And that's all based on, in part, the need to protect the conditions for species to be able to live and to have habitat and to be able to reproduce. And we're mostly talking about fish here. So in some cases, you don't get water until you make sure that the environmental water is already in place and will be in place. And what's left over is what people split up. Yeah. So I know that's not a firm answer, but that's kind of the priority of allocation. Now, that's not how it always happens, but that's how it happens for the majority of the water use in California, is that you looked first to how do we make sure there's enough cold water in the Sac River for salmon? How do we make sure that there's enough water that the delta salinity is not too high to protect the species that are in the delta and rely on the delta? And then we think about, all right, now what do people need for their cities? Okay, and then what do people need for growing stuff?
So you guys are last.
I mean, sometimes we're first, but sometimes we're last. And I think, that's just sort of how it works. And the regulators that are here in California and the fish agencies at the federal and state level and the water managers have a duty to balance all of that. They have to do that.
Mm-hmm. So before I interrupt, you're about to go into what you guys are looking forward to next year. Talking about the water bond.
Yeah.
Can you kind of go into the details of like how many votes do you guys need to get the bond on the ballot? And kind of where are you guys?
Well, I'll tell you, Farm Bureau is I think everybody's grappling with some of the disappointment from Prop 1. I mean, that was several years ago. It was almost 10 years ago. Think about that. That was 2014. But I think there were many people who felt like the infrastructure components of that didn't really pan out the way they wanted it to when it comes to storage and a lot of other things. And there's still some money that has been unspent from that bond. So a lot of people are a little gun shy right now about getting involved. And I think that for Farm Bureau, I mean, we certainly have priorities that we'd like to see, but at the same time, people feel a little burned a bit on a bond. Alex, personally, again, I know that there are things that you use a bond for that you can't fund otherwise. And I think, there's always going to be an appetite for a climate bond or natural resources bond, water bond, whatever you want to call it. There's some things that don't appropriately fit in funding from another category because there's no single beneficiary. It might be the fish or the beneficiary, or a community, public safety is a beneficiary, or water supply for half the state is a beneficiary. But so that is a long way of saying that, I don't know how many votes. I don't know.
You don't know?
I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question. I haven't really been involved in many legislative bonds. I've been involved a little bit in some of the ones that almost got off the ground a couple of years ago and then didn't. But so, I'm looking at it as what are the categories of things that are important to my members, and I want to make sure that they're included. But we have a complex relationship with a potential bond. But I mean, I want to see dam safety. Dam safety is a big thing right now, and there's a big need in a couple of specific areas in the state for more dam safety funding. I want to see more habitat restoration funding, to be honest, because you have to take care of that before you can allocate water to other things, right? Mm-hmm. So you have to make sure that you satisfy the habitat and species needs before you can use the water for the other stuff. So I want to see that funded. I want to see more conveyance, obviously. I mean, that was one of my big things at Friant, and it's still one of my big priorities because we know that you could have a year like this and have all the water in the world, but if you can't actually get it to the right places, then it's really hard to do recharge. It's really hard to use it appropriately and store it underground. So I've got my categories. Obviously, flood.
Is water ever wasted?
No.
No.
I don't think so. No. Because again, the water never disappears. It's all still here in some form. It never goes away. It's just used and reused and evaporates and comes back down as precipitation and goes back. And so, I mean, I guess the wasteful water would be if someone was, and there actually are definitions for this in the State Water Code for what is a waste of water. This is something the State Water Board regulates. If you're using too much water for something, if you are, waste and unreasonable use is a legal category of water. But when people talk about water being wasted to the ocean, I don't like that. I know what they're meaning, but I don't think that that's really what's going on. I think you either can't capture some of it physically, or you can't capture it because of regulation, because something else needs it. And that means the fish need it before the people can have the rest.
There's something interesting. Somebody's telling me that I guess the brackish water line has moved closer to Sacramento than it used to be. And
I mean,
that's kind of like what you're talking about, right?
Yeah,
if not enough fresh water is coming out, then there's a lot of water out there that's going to come in.
Well, and this is, I'm, again, I have to think now that I represent many water users in the Delta and elsewhere, I have to think about how to phrase this because it's a very touchy subject.
Right.
But brackish water, sort of that little bit saline, little bit fresh, mixing around and floating. I mean, that most of the water in the Delta, I think historically, my understanding is that a lot of it was brackish and the line has moved, and it moves dependent on the hydrology and how the projects and reservoirs are operated in the state. Mm-hmm. And there are certain targets and areas that, where you measure it in the Delta, and it can move depending on how much water is coming down. So like you have a really big water year and there's a lot of water coming down the rivers, the San Joaquin and the Sacramento, and it pushes the line out. And then if you have a lower water year, it can kind of creep back in. And that's to say nothing of the sea level rise and the potential for that to have an impact as well. So there are actually a lot of projects in the Delta right now that the Delta Conservancy and other folks are funding. I know that Metropolitan Water District of Southern California and the Nature Conservancy and some others have been doing these projects to try and reverse subsidence on certain Delta islands. So they're converting a lot of couple Delta islands have grown a lot of like corn and other things like that. And they're trying to transition it to rice because you have to, rice uses a lot of water, but you have standing water on those islands that have sunk from, subsidence over the years for multiple reasons. And so you're just basically putting a bunch of water on there, and it helps sort of reverse some of the subsidence that's happened on those islands. And that also in turn helps with, weathering against sea level rise and all these other factors.
Yeah. We had Jennifer Capitolo on.
Oh, yeah.
She took a totally different scope from here because she deals with people drinking water.
Yeah.
But one thing, we talked a lot about was, this whole, was it toilet to tap thing?
Yeah.
And about how a lot of that's being used for this kind of wetland recharging kind of thing.
And that's going on in a couple different places.
Like Elk Grove, right?
Yeah.
All of a sudden there's like tons of water down there by the I-5.
Yeah.
Is that something that's like looked at for like Stockton, some of these areas that maybe we could just kind of bump that up and recharge that Delta? Yeah.
I mean, well, there is water that the city of Sacramento and others discharge into the river that is treated wastewater. We have pretty high standards for water treatment. If you're treating wastewater, if you're discharging it, again, that's her area of expertise, not mine. But, there's also been interest in using recycled water for irrigation, and you can do that, but there are different standards you have to treat it to for different things you're growing. Mm-hmm. So it can get a little complex, but it's certainly one avenue. And I would say that in the depths of the drought, people do look at things like that about how can you use recycled water to irrigate. And there's more interest then. And then you have years like 2023 and the interest wanes and then it comes back. Right. But I think and definitely in Southern California, there are like toilet to tap things. It's not quite that. They name it different things, but I think there's been a psychological resistance to that with many people. But I don't think there should be. Yeah. Right. I mean, again, let's go back to even if you traded it, right? Exactly. The solution to pollution is solution. Right. Any water resources engineer or like environmental scientist or earth science person, like they all know that. I learned that when I was a planner. So it's not just how much you treat it, but how much it's diluted by other freshwater sources. Mm-hmm. And so, I mean, that becomes something that you can use for wetlands. You can use it for recharge. You can use it for irrigation. It just has different requirements in terms of how you treat it and what to do with it. Yeah. It's pretty interesting. The other day on I guess it's called X now. You posted a photo of you with, I guess you had some impromptu meetings you forgot about. Oh God. Yeah. So kind of what is your end of session looking like? What did it look? Yeah, no, that day there was something that we were doing. We were giving people awards because there are a few members this year who had been really, I don't want to say helpful, but they were helpful, but they were also, I don't know, just thoughtful about ag, right? And so we were going around and giving them these little plaques that said like, thank you, friend of the Farm Bureau, we love you. And I didn't have it on my calendar. And so I was wearing like a sundress and everybody else had suits on. So I felt like an idiot, but it turned out fine. I think for me, there are a lot of things my bucket is not just the legislature. It's also regulatory on like what's going on at the water board and other agencies. And so there have been a lot of things that are, I've been able to pivot to. Session ends and I stop looking or look less to the Capitol and more to like the Cal EPA building and other places where, my brain has been kind of split in two places and now I can focus more on that. So there's some upcoming, really regionally important things going on at the water board and like the Scott River and the Shasta River area up in the Klamath Basin. Also gearing up we have like our annual conference and meeting at Farm Bureau. This year it's in Reno, which is in a different state, but that wasn't my choice. That's someone else's choice. But that will be in December. So we've got that going on. Of course, it's conference season, right? So it's not just that. It's Association of California Water Agencies conferences, just speaking at different events.
Women in Water. Did you get an invite to Women in Water this year?
I've never gotten one. And I've asked them like 10 times. And everyone says to me every year, are you going? And I say, no, I'm not, because nobody's invited me, which, I think is an oversight on their part, but that's okay.
Maybe the law firms will, after they hear your riparian rights part,
they'll be like, that girl does not know what she is talking about. I'm like, I just know enough that I need to know in order to explain and understand why these bills are problematic or not. So there's that. I would say, there's a lot going on right now. We didn't talk about SGMA, Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, and compliance with that yet today or at all today, really. But there are a number of basins especially in the San Joaquin Valley, who are now beginning this, what they call a probationary process, potentially at the water board, where their groundwater sustainability plans are not up to snuff, according to DWR, despite their best efforts at limiting pumping and putting in fees and doing recharge projects. They're not quite there. And they're not going to be coming into compliance with the law. So DWR referred all of those to the water board. And now the water board is going to oversee how to get them in compliance with the law. And this is a whole new space that has not been done, a whole new process that has never been done before. And it is going to be looked at, I think, very closely by other areas of the state in terms of how groundwater is going to be, how basins that are not compliant with the law, groundwater basins, are going to be dealt with by the water board. So that's something we're going to have a really keen eye on. And so for the rest, for me personally, I don't know. I think I need to go through my basement at some point, but that's that's something that I was putting off until the end of session. So
wow, exciting!
I know.
Are you gonna have to deal with the politics at all? A lot of new candidates kind of crossing over. Are you doing?
Yeah, am I doing what?
Meet and greets with some new folks?
Yes, as much as we can. Mm-hmm. I kind of tag along to those. I like let some of my colleagues set those up, and then I just tag along. There's a lot of education that needs to happen, and we saw this last year. I think there were some members who were surprised, who were not even that new, but were surprised at the amount of attention that their bills got that dealt with water rights or groundwater recharge or adjudications or anything like that. This is a big thing. This is the fourth largest economy in the world. And that is built largely on things like water rights.
Right.
And so you can't just kind of stick your fingers in that and muck around without having a really big fight. I don't know how else to say it. And I don't think that's going to stop. And I think it's not that changes can't be made to the system. It's more that you have to figure out how to do it in such a way that you don't pull a thread here and it unravels everything else. Right. And that's really hard to do. And even the people that are experts in this field, they're still learning too. We all are. And so there is some education that I do hope to do, because I like people. I like meeting new people. And so when we have this next year, whenever we have that new crop of folks coming in at some point, then hope to continue that sort of education process. But I'm still learning too. So we all are.
It's never ending.
It isn't.
Twitter's kind of evolved over the last couple of years. How are you doing with the change to X? And are you spending time elsewhere? I think I saw you post a Threads thing.
I try. I'm really, here's my take. All right. Because it's backed by Meta, I feel like Threads has probably the best chance of becoming a real competitor. And a lot of people are trying to make it a thing, but it feels like that line. I don't know if you've seen Mean Girls, but it's like fetch. It's fetch.
Yeah.
Try to stop what is the line? It's stop trying to make fetch happen. It's not going to happen, right? That's the line. And I do feel like everyone's given it the college try, but there's some features that are missing. There's no DM feature. I still don't think we have hashtags. Like there are all sorts of things on Threads that are, I think, deficient.
So you've really given it a go.
I have. Yeah. And I've tried Blue Sky, which some people like as well. You need like a invitation code, which, so there's some sort of like gatekeeping there that I don't love. Tried that one, Post, Mastodon, all of these. Everyone said, oh, we're all going to switch en masse to something else. But
Truth Social?
I do not have a Truth Social account. Unfortunately, that is the one I do not dip my toe into. So yeah, don't do Truth Social. But I personally, I still am a fan of Twitter. It's gotten a little weird for sure. And I mean, God, is Elon Musk just running that thing into the ground or what? I mean, the last valuation was what, like $8 billion or something? Wow. I mean, I think I read that and I was like, oh my God, you did that? Ooh. But I mean, it's still, I think it is for political types and for agencies and for anyone dealing in the policy world and the political world. I think X, Twitter, whatever you want to call it, is still the place you need to engage, certainly with folks in the Capitol community. Mm-hmm. I see some of them on Threads, but not that many of them. And certainly not heavily used as much. And what I've been trying to do is just like, now I have to say, I can't tweet it. If I post something on X, then I will go and put the same thing on Threads. Mm-hmm. But there aren't very many good apps right now to kind of push it out to multiple platforms.
Do you keep track of your followers? Like,
I mean, that's the other problem is how do I find the people? I said to someone the other day, or maybe I put this on Threads just because I was feeling pretty spicy about it, but the people I follow on Threads are people that I initially followed on Instagram to see pictures, not read their words. Mm-hmm. And now I'm following the picture people's words, and I don't want to read those words. Right. I just wanted to see their photos. And so it's like the community is different, right?
Right.
Like there's something weird about that. It pushed all the people I followed from Instagram and I wanted to see their pictures. And now I'm reading their words and I don't really want to read their words. Yeah. I just wanted to see the pictures.
It's like a mishmash of
a mishmash.
Facebook.
Yeah. So because it is backed by Meta, it seems like that has the biggest potential to really take over. But I think they really need to migrate some features over there.
That's interesting.
Yeah. I don't know about you. What do you think? Like,
I've just noticed it's gotten like a lot, like people left. I remember it used to be pretty, even or maybe even a little left leaning.
Yeah.
And now it's right leaning for sure. Like, I mean, and I don't know if it's like my followers or what. Yeah. But I used to have a good mix of both. And I just get like I just see some interesting things on there. Like, oh, is this how people think now? Like, wow, that's random.
I don't know. I don't feel like I've necessarily seen that, but I have seen some defection by folks or people who just kind of shut down their accounts entirely, which is unfortunate. But I think, again, for the Capitol community, it's still a pretty big platform.
Definitely. Do people like notice you in the building because of your social profile?
Not necessarily.
Is it a cheat code? No.
Is it what?
Is it a cheat code in there?
Is there a cheat code?
God,
no.
I follow you.
Oh my God. No, but I did have a farmer in Richvale, way up in the Sac Valley, at the Richvale Cafe. I was sitting there and he walks in and he looks at me and he goes, "You just got a new job." I had never seen this person before in my life. And this was like a month after I joined Farm Bureau. I said, I did? Hello. And he said, "Your hair's not pink anymore." And I was like, Okay. So I found out who that was eventually, but he's a farmer. He followed me and I followed him, but I didn't make the connection because I'd never seen his picture. So that was probably the funniest one. It hasn't happened in the Capitol necessarily. Although there are people who I recognize because I follow them on Twitter and then I'm like sitting in a hearing room with them and I'm like, I know who that is, but is it weird if I'm the person that comes up and says, "I follow you"? But
do you have like people you like tweet back and forth with that you just have never talked to in real life that you see
100%. Yeah. Don't worry. I'll get there eventually. I'll find a way to like make them my friend or at least.
Did you talk to Joe Patterson yet in person?
I have. Yeah. Well, it was before he was even, elected here. So, but I think he and I started following each other on Twitter and then I ran into him at the
noticeably
brasserie
absent
or something.
From the Farm Bureau Friends Awards.
Joe, he has an open offer if he ever wants to talk about water. I sent a note to him after he got elected. I was like, "You ever want to talk water?" I'm happy to do it. I could talk about it all day. So it's out there, Joe. But he's great on Twitter. And what's fun about him is that I see him engaging with policy folk and lobbyists and advocates on Twitter who are probably people that he wouldn't otherwise engage with, and they end up finding common ground on things. And I've watched these interactions with him and a few other people and a few other members that way who are like, wait a minute, no, we actually agree on this. Maybe we can do something about this. And so it's absolutely, and like I've had that happen with me too, with other people who are maybe on the NGO side who I connected with first on Twitter, and now we're, having meetings and working on things. And I think it is, because it's a more casual platform, it's like a lower risk, I think, for people to engage, and you find the center of that Venn diagram, I think, more easily. So it's fun to watch that happen, and it's happened a lot. Yeah. So I hope it survives, right? I want it to.
Yeah. Well, Alex, always fascinating as always. Thank you so much for taking the time. And
thanks for having me on again.
All our listeners, please give Alex a follow at Blonde Alex. Definitely worth it. So
thank you, Jared.
Till next time.
All right.
Thank
you.